Well, thank you very much indeed, Charles. As Charles mentioned, I have a rather unusual background in that I trained as a social anthropologist before becoming an economics reporter. Aside from that, though, I also spent the late 1990s working in Japan, looking at the Japanese banking crisis, and that very much informs the way I look at the current situation, not just in the US, but Europe too. When I was working in Japan in the late 1990s, there would often be US officials who would come into Tokyo and would sit around the table and talk. And a common theme of discussion, or a common joke, was that what Japan needed in the late 1990s was basically a Goldilocks bond market shock. Goldilocks, as you might remember, is that wonderful fairy tale character who eats porridge that is neither not too hot and not too cold, just right. And during the 1990s, people used to talk a lot about Goldilocks economic recoveries on a pace of growth that was not too fast, not too slow, but just right to have non-inflationary growth. So we coined the phrase Goldilocks bond market shock, meaning something that would be just big enough to shock Japan out of its political paralysis and get the different political parties in Japan to sit around the table and agree to do something, but not too big to blow up the entire Japanese financial system. Because, of course, Japanese banks and savers have been gobbling up JGBs in recent years, and anybody can see that if there ever was a very large increase in long-term interest rates in Japan, it would have very negative results. So we used to sit around and say what Japan needs is a little shock, one that's perfectly contained, but enough to break the political impasse. Well, of course, Japan has never had that. They've managed repeatedly to defy the forces of gravity to keep interest rates low, and as a result, there's never been enough of an external shock to persuade the Japanese political class to actually do anything about their mounting structural problems. But to my mind, I think that the issue of the Goldilocks bond market shock is extremely pertinent now to a country such as the US. Because in ways that I would never, ever have dreamt for a millisecond a decade ago when I used to sit in Tokyo and wail about Japan, there are many parallels between the problems in the political economy in Japan and the US today. Personally speaking, I find this fascinating because when I first became a journalist about 15 years ago, armed with my weirdo PhD in social anthropology based on fieldwork conducted in Tajikistan, which I would bet that not many of you have ever been to or necessarily can even identify on a map. I used to feel very embarrassed about having this background because certainly 5 or 6 years ago it seemed like the only degrees that really counted on Wall Street or the City of London were degrees in astrophysics or advanced mathematics or an MBA. And having a background in anthropology was regarded with an awful lot of suspicion. But if there's one thing we've learnt in the last few years, it's that finance really does link very closely to culture. The roots of the word credit come from the Latin credere, meaning to believe, which is fundamentally a social construct. And the question of how social organizations, how cognitive maps, how people think develop over time is absolutely crucial to finance. And right now, the question of how political systems interact and how institutions operate, which is very much the territory of anthropologists, is also crucial to trying to work out what happens in the US economy and what happens with global imbalances. Because, to go back to the Japanese issue, the question of Goldilocks bond market shock, the real problem with the US right now, the real problem with the global imbalances question, is not just a problem of GDP numbers, inflation rates, etc. It's really about the political institutions, about whether or not they have the ability to not just formulate decisions, but to actually implement them too. One of the issues I'm personally fascinated by in the US context, partly because of my Japanese experience, is this issue of social cohesion. Japan has a very high level of social cohesion, an extraordinary history of basically sharing out pain in a way that ensures that almost everyone in society buys into society and people pull together with a sense of shared sacrifice. I used to joke when I was in Japan that if a Japanese company has to cut its wage bill by 10%, it tends to essentially cut everyone's wage by 10% and keep everyone employed. In the UK, you'd normally fire 10% of the workers, and in the US, you'd probably fire 20% of the workers and pay the CEOs 10% more. But there is a strong sense in Japan of shared cohesion, which both has good and bad things. On the one hand, it means that the Japanese have an amazing ability to endure pain, tremendous ability to accept gaman, shared suffering. But they also have this political logjam, which means that almost nothing gets done unless there is an external shock. If you look to Europe today, in terms of whether they have the ability to tackle the fiscal problems, you have a really fascinating set of different trends and different patterns. I mean, Greece, to my mind, is a country which is not blessed with a lot of social cohesion. There doesn't appear to be a strong sense of an ability to pull together and take tough decisions as of yet. Ireland, which is a country I know very well because a large part of my increasingly impoverished relatives live in Ireland, is a country which actually, until now at least, has had a tremendously high level of social cohesion and an ability thus far to actually accept some of the painful choices that may now be cracking or not. But to my mind, the really key question right now is the US, and not just its ability to come together and take difficult decisions without an external shock, but also its ability to have enough social cohesion to ensure that there is buy-in in the population to actually act. I find the US fascinating because in so many ways it's the polar opposite of a country like Japan in terms of its political economy. Not just for the obvious reasons to do with entrepreneurship and things and individualism, but above all else, rooted in this idea that so much of American history is based on this concept of the pioneer spirit of there being no resource constraint and a belief in the ability to have permanent growth. I mean, America was founded on the principle that if you run out of land in the east, you simply go west, young man. You can always keep growing, growing, growing. And the answer to every problem is to make the pie bigger, not to worry about how to divide the pie up. And that's kind of fine as long as the pie is growing. But right now, America is on the edge of facing a world where the pie could be fixed, if not shrinking. And it doesn't appear clear to me that it actually has the mechanism in place to divide the pie up in a way that will keep everyone buying in, or for that matter, to actually divide the pie up at all, make the tough decisions without that external shock. So I come back to my original point. Can America have a Goldilocks bond market shock? Can it have enough of an external awakening, an external excuse, a political trigger to get people to come around the table and actually make tough decisions? Or will it keep staving off the moment of truth until essentially, as Governor Yellen says, the markets force a pace of change, force a pace of decision-making, which would be far more unpleasant than if acted now. Coming from a country like the UK, where have spent a lot of my time recently talking to people in the City of London and the UK government, the UK's experience right now is fascinating because, in some ways, Greece is the single best thing that ever happened to George Osborne. It provides a ready-made excuse to tell the British population that they need to buckle up, rally round, pull out a bit of that blitz spirit, come together and actually do something. And yet, thus far at least, the UK has not actually had to cope with a real-life bond market shock in that the borrowing rates have remained low. America is not yet at that point. And yet, for me, the big question above all else is how will the political economy actually respond in the coming months if there is not an external shock? And thankfully, I think that's a question which has as much to do with anthropology as economics. So thank you.